Hi. I'm calling this video Capitalism, a Ghost Story in 3 episodes. This is for the channel What's Wrong with the World and How to Fix It on Terry Lay. Okay, so why am I calling it a ghost story? Wait a minute. Well, let me start off by saying what's wrong with conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories have the idea that there's this shadowy elite that's up there pulling strings. And you can look at capitalism like that in terms of an evil elite pulling strings, the capitalist class and so on. In a way, this evil elite's quite obvious and apparent. I mean, you know that people like Rupert Murdoch are part of this class and Bezos and so on, you know, it's no mystery. But the other problem with it is that in a way, what it misunderstands is the fact that capitalism operates as a social machine, and that people in general are caught up in this social machine and participate in its construction. And it's not just the ruling elite that create all of this stuff. And I like to use the phrase "the ghost in the machine" to refer to, you know, like Gilbert Ryle, a philosopher talking about mind-body problems, coined this phrase, and I kind of like it for looking at new social theory in relationship to society, which is that that societies like what Marx calls modes of production are animated by a kind of ideological underpinning, a sort of taken for granted set of assumptions, rules of the game, and I tend to think of it as like you know, like a game of chess or football or something like that, with various players and positions and rules, which constitutes the sort of background assumptions through which the game, as you see it on the TV or in the, you know, in real life, whatever is played out. And you can look at this in terms of theories like Foucault and Castoriadis, the ghost of a dominant discourse, or what Castoriadis calls an unconscious imaginary. So, okay, so looking at capitalism like this, it's an invention of the human species. It's another kind of class society. I've talked about them in previous YouTubes. In Marx's terms, it's a mode of production, meaning, you know, a way people relate around the production of material items. It's a social imaginary, and this is the ghost in the machine, and approximate dates of capitalism are 1600 to the present time. And lots of people think it will never go away, which seems to me very unlikely. I'm sure it will, eventually, at any rate. The key features of its ghostly construction. Okay, so what are the key animating ideas of capitalism? Okay, the first one is that the means of production, meaning, you know, like things that produce material items and also other items, anything that you can sell really, are owned privately and can be sold on the market. So this is really different to feudal society, for example, where the lord of the manor can't sell the manor on the market at all. It's got to be passed on to his eldest son or whoever it might be, and he's got it from his father, and so on and so forth. And ultimately, the king theoretically owns it and has lent it to the lord of the manor, to, you know, who swears allegiance to the king. I mean, there's all this kind of stuff, which means that basically that means the production is not on the market. This is different in capitalist society. The basic means of production are on the market. And one of the consequences of this is that in order to maintain their value, which is measured in money in capitalist societies, then they have to be put into play. You can't just sort of sock it away under the bed or you know, just leave it in a bank, or because, you know, the value of money changes, and what you have to do is put it out there and make it work. So say you have a piece of land, if you just leave it, it doesn't have any value if you just leave it alone and do nothing with it. The minute you start making things and selling those things on the market, then your farm has value. The value your farm has is its potential to make money. And, you know, in order to maintain value, you have to actually be making money out of it. So the second item of the ghostly construction is that there's a distinction between employers and employees. Employers own the means of production and pay people, their workers, you know, like whether they're middle class or working class or whatever, to do work and to produce value, which they, you know, produce objects or whatever, which they then, the owners can then sell on the market. And there's also a class of people who are potential employees, you know, in the sense that if they could get a job, they would. I'll talk about them in a minute again. The third item, the means of production can be sold. Oh, I've said that already. Sorry, it's not. So anyway, just to re-emphasize it, this is really important. Also, the fourth item, which I'm going to say, is that labor can be sold on the market as free labor. Like in classic capitalism, at any rate, the employee has the possibility of going to different firms or businesses or government departments and offering their labor power to be bought by their employer. They're not constrained to just go to the one. Well, again, completely different to feudal society where the peasants attached to a particular landlord. Nevertheless, as Marx says, they're slaves to the whole of the capitalist class. What that means is that in order to live, you have to sell your labor power to live. So potential employees, a large number of whom are located in developing countries, basically scraping by. You know, there are 1 billion people who are going hungry and another 1 billion who are suffering from various kinds of food deficiency diseases, anemia and so on like that, because they're not getting a good diet. So these are people who, you know, if they could possibly get a job, they would get a job. So these are potential employees. And then the last point, the way in which capitalist society extracts surplus value, surplus product, if you like, for the ruling class, and a surplus gets transferred from the workers, from the ordinary people to the ruling class, is through surplus value, meaning this, that people get paid a wage, but the wage is not the full monetary value of the monetary value they produce in their working day for the capitalists. So they might produce $150 worth of extra value to the capitalist firm, but they're only getting paid $100 of that value. So whereas in feudal society, this tribute's really obvious and apparent, you know, like, okay, it's bags of wheat or whatever going to the lord of the manor's house and so on, and from the peasant's field. Here in capitalism, it's kind of like concealed in a way, because it's like two equal players meet in the market. The worker sells their labor power, and the capitalist, you know, gives them money for that, and that's what the worker's worth, and so on. But actually, there's a concealed extraction of surplus value from this. Now, capitalism in current society and throughout history doesn't exist separate from other social machines. It's articulated in relationship to other social machines. My view is that capitalism dominates these other social machines, in the sense that the ownership of the means of production is massively important. For example, the richest 1% owns 50% of global wealth. The richest 10% of the population accounts for 85% of household wealth. So wealth is massively unequally distributed. And what this means, when we take away household, you know, like houses and cars and things that the rich people use, and we just look at their productive capital, in other words, where they're employing people and making money through that, then there's even more of a concentration of wealth than these figures reveal. I hope you get that. The richest 50% of the population owns 99% of wealth. So what we can say from that is that there definitely is a middle class in global society today. Okay, so they are, you know, like, okay, so if you look at the capitalist 1% owning 50% of global wealth, and then the next 10, and the whole 10% owns 85%, and the whole 50% owns 99%. The middle class in global terms, if you like, is located in that gap between the 10% and the 50%. Okay, so what are the other social machines that despite the dominance of capitalism in the economy, what other social machines is it articulated with or connected to, linked up to? Well, slavery in the developing countries and in you know, in the past, certainly in the United States and other colonial countries where people were exploited and like owned by the ruling classes. Then there's feudal dependency existing into the present time where landlords own large tracts of land and rent it out to farmers who really haven't got a choice to go anywhere else. This is almost like a feudal situation, what's sometimes called debt peonage, where people go where people go into debt to their landlord and they can't leave because they owe a vast amount of debt to the landlord and so on. So these are regimes of exploitation, if you like, in the world which don't depend upon free labor. In other words, there's no actual freedom of the worker to offer their services to a variety of different possible employers. They're chained down to a particular place. This is typical of the third world in many situations. Then there's women's work in housework and childcare. Women do a very unequal share of this domestic work, and that domestic work, of course, is necessary for workers, both men and women, to enter the labour market and perform labour. In other, you know, They in a sense, even in shopping, they do the work of turning consumer goods into things that are useful to the household, and so make the capitalist system possible. And then there's unpaid subsistence work in developing countries. So similar to housework in the rich countries, in many developing countries, families work like this. Like, let's look at Africa because I know about it really closely. But I mean, okay, so women and children are often staying home on the farm, which is in, you know, separate out in the rural area, and growing food for the family to live on. This is subsistence agriculture. They're just not selling that. They're not selling that food. They're just eating it. In the meantime, the husband or father or whatever is going to the city or going to another estate owned by a landlord or you know, a capitalist or whatever, and earning a wage, which is some of which is being brought back to the family. So there's this kind of situation where the father and husband can't actually run the family without the subsistence, the addition of this subsistence work and subsistence production. So again, what we find is that the capitalist system is linked up to some other system. And then there's racism. So racism justifies the existence of an underclass, the unequal relationships between the rich countries and the developing countries and so on. It provides an ideological backdrop and allocates people for the roles of underclass within the framework of a capitalist social machine. Okay, so what I've now outlined are the sort of ghostly features, if you like, the rules of the game, you know, like as in a game of chess, the rules of the game of capitalism. Now, what I'm going to look at is there are various effects of these rules that operate in the machine in practice. So competition between firms for profits and market share. So the fact that goods and, you know, that the means of production can be sold in a privately owned mean, and the fact that the way to make money and to become rich and to hang on to the money that you already have and so on and make it current, etc., is by putting goods for sale on the market. That means that these different firms and so on are in competition with each other. So monopolies change this a bit, but they don't completely alter it, because there's always the possibility of money going to another branch of industry or something like that. So in other words, money floats and can be moved around the place, meaning that firms are necessarily in competition and have to succeed in making a profit to be viable. So one of the ways that they do that is that they create new technologies to reduce labor requirements. So if they can cut the cost of the workforce by bringing in a new technology, they do that. They bring in new technology so they can produce goods cheaper and produce attractive new consumer goods that people are going to want, and make a market success through that, to increase their sales and their market share, and so their profits and so on. This kind of technological productivity, if you like, an invention, is a feature of classic capitalist societies. This leads to a growth of the economy. So, you know, in other words, if every firm's competing to sell more and to produce more with less costs and so on, the end result is in fact produces growth. And now I'll come back to that later on. But this growth also produces an environmental impact, meaning that yeah, I'll talk about that again later. But basically, I know, here it is. Capitalists externalize environmental costs to maximize profits in a situation of competition. What that means is that if you can get away with producing an environmental, you know, if it's cheaper to produce things that are in a way that's environmentally damaging, the capitalist is forced to produce them in the cheapest way possible in order to maximize profits in a situation of competition. So they'll choose that environmentally damaging way. Not because they want to do environmental damage. That's not the point. The point is to make the most profits possible. So this is sort of built into the structure of capitalism. The last element of the machine in practice that I want to look at is the way technological complexity requires participation of the workforce and kind of active, you know, like being involved, doing things on your own initiative, thinking about the way things are working, making little adjustments to make sure things work, and so on and so forth. So again, capitalism is really different to class societies of the past, where work's really monotonous and boring, and basically people are told what to do something that's totally traditional and can be easily supervised by a managerial you know, group or whatever. In capitalism, it's not like that. The constant technological change, which is created by this competition between firms, means that people, the working people, have to be on the ball and participate, to be highly educated and so forth. And that's how capitalism works. And it gives working people more power in capitalist society than the subordinate classes have had in other kinds of class societies. So these are the basic dynamics of how capitalism works. So let's now what I want to do is to talk about this in 3 episodes. So the first episode is what I call the first world bargain. Okay, so this was achieved from about 1850, you know, through till about 1975. We're looking at this really long period. So how did this work? So I'm going to talk about it as a first world bargain, but before I do that, I'll look at what was going on in the developing countries in relationship to this bargain. In the developing countries, there were authoritarian governments, originally colonial governments, but later on after liberation, various kinds of dictatorships like the Suharto dictatorship in Indonesia and so on. These ensured that the low cost of labor, because working class were not able to organize unions and go on strike and bargain for higher wages and so on. And also because the developing countries are in competition with each other to produce goods at the lowest possible prices. So they produce raw materials and primary products, you know, like flours, wheat, tea, etc., for the rich countries. So the poverty in those developing countries is an effect of that. The low rate of employment reflects the fact that there's only a limited number of consumers in the rich countries who can buy stuff. But it also creates a situation in which everyone's competing for a job and the price of labor is really low in that situation. There's a mediated exploitation of third world workers by affluent first world workers. So like say in 2006, I went to South Africa. Per week, you know, the vast majority of people were getting something like, you know, ordinary people in South Africa were getting something like $40 a week for their work. A vast amount of this work was going to make things which were later bought by ordinary people in the rich countries, you know, like cars, macadamia nuts, you know, just to mention a few items, platinum, you know, whatever. Now, how much were those workers in the rich countries getting paid? Well, in Australia at that time, it was like between $800 and $1,000 a week. So we're comparing $40 a week to $800 to $1,000 a week. There's obviously a huge difference there. What that effectively means is that the worker in Australia can buy, you know, a vast amount of work, labor hours put into work from South Africa with their half hour of work in Australia, right? So there's a mediated exploitation. So it's important to realize that in some sense that the workers in the rich country, not just the capitalist class, obviously wanted the cheapest work they could get in the developing countries, but also the ordinary workers also bought into this. So that's part of the first world bargain. There's what I call a mediated exploitation of third world workers by affluent first world workers. The first world workers were like the intermediate class of previous class societies, you know, like the soldiers in the Roman Empire, you know, like the soldiers in Egypt, the craft people and trade workers in Egypt and so on. So these are people who can be pressed into service to put down rebellions in tricky developing country situations. And of course that happened. And later on, they just paid money to the rich elites who then paid their own soldiers to do that work. But certainly all through the 19th century, it was huge. You know, working class people in England, if you go to the folk songs, huge. They were going in vast armies to put down rebellions in India and Africa and God knows where. And you can look at wars like the Vietnam War and so on as aspects of this situation continuing. In the rich countries, in the first world, there were demands for wage affluence through unions, left parties, riots and revolutions. So people were worried by the 1917 revolution in Russia. And not only that, but before that, the threat of revolution, like, you know, in other countries, in the rich countries. And so the capitalist class accommodated these demands. This is why I call it a bargain. And this was how the bargain works. Okay, so the endless competition between firms drives increasing productivity, means you can produce more cheaper and you can pay workers more in terms of material goods. They're getting more material goods for their hours of work than they used to and so on. The unions push this, the left parties push this and so on, and gradually the wages and living standards of affluent workers in the rich countries increased. My argument is this process started in the 1850s and 1860s and gradually continued right up to you know 1975 or something like that. And what I'd also be saying about this situation is that these demands were hard to resist in terms because of the technological complexity. That if the workforce goes on strike, and it's very hard to replace those workers who were doing that particular job with another group of workers from somewhere else who were not educated and not experienced in that particular job, and it's massively complex, you know, bits and pieces. And this led to increasing affluence in the first world, and by the 1930s and thereafter, and especially after the Second World War in the 1950s, there was what sociologists sometimes refer to as a social wage, meaning social welfare, unemployment benefits, health, you know, public housing, transport services, and so on, funded by governments or actually nationally owned. So that's a social wage in the sense that people are getting some kinds of real benefits and increasing their standard of living through this pressure. Okay, so that's the first episode, the first world bargain. And one of the things I wanted to say about that I'm now going to move on to the second episode. Sorry, I'm not going to say anything about that. The second episode is what I call globalization. So a number of things happened which ended up with globalization, which I think is the most significant development. I think neoliberalism is what was able to be achieved after globalization had created a strategic change in the balance of power in rich countries. Okay, so revolutions in the third world provided the conditions for education. So again, looking at some countries that I know pretty well, like Indonesia and Africa, the liberation struggles at the end of the Second World War in the case of Indonesia, and in the 90s in South Africa and so on, provided the conditions for increasing the educational levels of the population at large and the skill levels of the population at large. That was a prior condition, if you like. In the first world, as I've suggested already, There were increasing inroads into the power of the capitalist class through the social wage, through full employment, job security, and affluence. In other words, all of these things are strengthening the hand of the working class in the rich countries. One of the ways that this was expressed was for an escalation of demands, demands to control work, demands for ever higher wages, and so forth and so forth, demands for an increasing share of public ownership and public control of the capitalist class, increasing regulation, environmental regulations, and so on. The capitalist class got very pissed off with this. They were not at all happy with the way things were working out. And that led to riot. So with the form of this pressure took was riots, you know, like all the black riots in America, in various cities of America, you know, the 1968 riots and rebellion in Paris and so on. Sabotage in work, you know, like the people working in boring jobs in factories would actually sabotage the operation of the plant to get an afternoon off or something like that. Wildcat strikes, in other words, not authorized by the union, the whole factory or workforce would go out on strike, and so on. So now the rich responded to this, you know, like these are actions and so on, but my argument would be not through some sort of conspiracy and they got together and worked out how to do this. But what they realized was that all of this kind of grumpy and annoying working class in the rich countries could be readily subverted if they moved their a large part of their operations to the developing countries. All right, like as I said, these people that, you know, you could put a factory in Indonesia or Taiwan or South Africa or whatever, knowing that the workforce were well and truly educated sufficiently to make this factory work. You know, why leave it in Liverpool? Where the workers are so much trouble? Why not go to South Africa where wages are really low, where the government's very authoritarian, doesn't allow any unions to organise, and so forth and so on. So this wasn't a conspiracy, but individual capitalists started to realise this and copied other capitalists doing this, and this led to what we now call globalisation. The other things that made globalisation possible, as Hoogveld, a wonderful author on this, talks about, was containerization. So it was possible to ship things around the world in standardized containers that, you know, that were easy to unpack and pack and kind of created the option for joining together different parts of production. So you'd make the gearbox in one country and, you know, the starter engine in another country and so forth and so on, put the car together like that. And then digital communication, so people could go, you know, on the internet, and kind of connect to people. And go and operate, you know, like a firm could operate over a number of different countries at once. So these are the things that enabled globalization. Yeah, as I said, low-wage countries, authoritarian governments, and educated workforce. So let's look at some of the things that the effects of globalization then. I'm just going to list them: the stagnation of, and maybe I'll give a few figures and maybe I won't bother. They're easy to find. Piketty, I've been using Adam Jamrosik on the welfare state in Australia, really interesting book. And of course, you know, there's vast amounts written on this stuff. Oxfam's a really good source of figures and so on. So stagnation of wages in rich countries. So the bottom, you know, like the bottom 20%, their wages actually started to decline like 1% per year, while the richest 10%, their wages had been going up 10% per, you know, 6% per annum, they're increasing. Increased share to elites. I can't avoid that. I'll just yeah, but Piketty's really good on this. The top 1%, right? 1920 to 1950, they typically, like before the welfare state got started, in other words, the rich 1% was getting 10 to 12% share of the national income in rich countries, right? Between 1950 and 1985, with the welfare state and all these demands that I've been talking about, it dropped to 5%, like halved, right? That was how effective these kind of left-wing pressures were from left parties and unions and so on in this period in the rich countries. But by 2005, it had climbed again to 10%, right? So in other words, the rich have now recovered the share of wealth that they used to have right back before the welfare state. We look at the USA, that now we're looking at the top 10%, same thing with incomes, but before 1910 to 1940, the top 10% was getting 43% of national income. But then 1945 to 1980, with bigger taxes and more welfare state and so on, was only getting 33% of national income. But by 1980 to 2000, it was getting 50% of national income. Most was in the top 1%. So then there was a winding back of some government services, increased social welfare. So what I mean by that is that, like, it's very interesting. There was a huge rhetoric of, oh, you know, making the state smaller and big government's a bad thing and coming from Reagan and Thatcher and all these sort of people. And the same, you know, same people, Howard, Fraser and so on in Australia and all that. Now, this rhetoric was really misleading in this sense, in that the share of gross domestic product going to government out of the population at large didn't actually change all that much. This is a funny thing about it. It stayed pretty much the same right through this period of neoliberalism. And yet we have the feeling that government services have been massively cut back, and we're not wrong. And why are we not wrong? Because what happened was that money that had previously been devoted to, you know, universities and public housing and so on is now going to social welfare. Why? Because the effect of this globalization is to shift power to the rich. And what have the rich done with that power that they've got in the first world countries? They've undermined the conditions of employment. So instead of getting a regular full-time job, full employment, and now you get one or maybe two or three casual jobs. You have to jump between them. You don't get holiday pay. The effect is massive increase in unemployment. So like it jumped in Australia, I think, from 1%, you know, during the whole social welfare period from 1950 on, to 6% during this, and it hasn't changed much since. But these figures are massively understate the problem, because in terms of the casual workforce, like, yeah, okay, so the casual workforce has gone up. Let me find that figure. Yeah, the casual workforce. Where is it? Oh yeah, here we go. Average hours. No, where is it? Oh, I can't find it now. It basically jumped to about 28% from a low figure of like 10 to 12% in Australia, and this was the situation in the whole of the world. The other thing about it is that whereas the unemployment figures show like 6% or something like that, 3% say in UK, the underemployed is huge. Like, so only 74% of the people of employable age are actually working. Same thing in Italy, you know, like it's like down to 50% of the people of that age group are working. So what we have is a massive underemployment. And now to prevent these people going on the streets and causing riots and destruction and so on, they're being paid unemployment benefits. The level of unemployment benefits is actually dropping down. And so there are huge numbers of working poor who are doing part-time casual work and not getting enough money to get by, and so on and so forth. So that although governments are not spending less money, the money is going into social welfare that's necessary to deal with the effects, long-term effects of globalization, leading to neoliberalism, leading to casualization of the workforce, unemployment, and so on. And then what we also find is a galloping cost of essentials. So consumer goods, like what attracted ordinary people to the globalization idea was that you could get consumer goods, white goods, cars and so on, cheaper from China than you could make them in the rich countries. Like, you know, why? Because of course wages are like rock bottom in China and India and you know, Taiwan and so on. Not a problem. Okay, oh, that's great. Oh, yeah. Let's get rid of tariffs and all these washing machines flood the market at dirt cheap prices. But the other kind of things that you can't get in that way, their prices skyrocket. The price of housing's gone up. The price of healthcare's gone like, tripled. The price of education's gone up by 2.5 times. All of that, right? So even the price of food and so on has gone up. So essentials have gone up, whereas these other goods have declined. So that's the second episode of capitalism. The third episode is what I'm going to call a cliffhanger. And in other words, this is what we don't know what might or may not happen. So what we can say is that there's the end of the deal, the end of the first world bargain. The first world bargain was increasing affluence and wages, right? Productivity increases because of technological inventions caused by competition and so on. And the cooperation of the ordinary people with the capitalist class in the social compact, as it were. Okay, so what's killing that off? Okay, first of all is globalization, which I've talked about. Secondly, the environmental crisis. There is no way to maintain the standard level of affluence of the rich countries and also deal with the climate crisis and other kinds of environmental crisis like the plastics crisis and God knows what that we're now facing. And perhaps thirdly, we don't really know this, but it could be that there's a failure of invention in the sense we've run out of technologies that can produce things more cheaply and, with less labor and less materials and so on. There have been, of course, globalization's led to some small gains for the global middle class. In other words, like the workers in South Africa or working in car factories in South Africa are doing better than they would have, starving in a rural village. That's certainly true. But at the same time, what's ignored when people play this up and go, oh, look how good this is that like there's 1 billion people not getting enough to eat, and there's another billion suffering from malnutrition. Like you look at the stunting rates in Africa, like they're up to 25 to 50% of children under 5 are stunted from not getting enough to eat in their first 5 years. I mean, capitalism is hardly an epitome of efficiency if you look at it in terms of human needs. It's a complete disaster. Anyway, and the third thing, what I'd also say about this current situation is that the end of reformist options. Like, okay, from the period, like, I'm dating it right back to 1850, but certainly from the 1950s on, increasing the power of governments, increasing the welfare state, increasing wages and better conditions, regulating environmental problems a bit, all of those kind of reformist options to deal with capitalism work. They just don't work anymore. You know why? Because the capitalists can move their operations to a country that it doesn't have those regulations and isn't doing that. And they do that all the time. They're constantly moving, they move their printing industry from Hong Kong to the Philippines to Taiwan, from Australia in the first place, and so on. This happens all the time. So, and yet politically, globalization is a complete trap for the left and also prevents reformist proposals, because the only way to make these reformist proposals work is really to cut off a particular first world economy from the rest of the world and start producing our own stuff on our own land and that kind of thing, and running our own show and therefore not being subjected to this threat of constant offshoring and so on. But if you do that, what happens then? Well, we know very well what happens then. The price of all of these consumer goods that have been so massively cheap goes up. And what does the population do? They go, oh, we don't want that. So governments can rabbit on like, Trump rabbiting on about how he's going to change all that. He's not going to change all that. There's no way. He's going to make a few mild gestures. Same with Biden's. They're not in reformist. There's no reformist solutions. Okay. So to me, it seems to me at the moment, there are two drastic alternatives. We can either have a re-feudalization of class society, or we can have degrowth and revolution. Okay, so what's a re-feudalization look like? It's like more of the same, in other words. markets target the rich. In other words, the top 10% of consumers are the ones for whom most production is oriented. You know, I read in this morning's paper that it was like 50% of what's being produced is going to that top 10% or even 1%. I can't remember. You know, yeah, that's right. Because what's happening is that the bottom 90% of the population in the rich countries is gradually losing, End of that story is they end up the same level as the people in South Africa, you know, 5 children under 5, 25 to 50% stunted from mouth. You know, okay, that's where we'll end up, right? The only way to get that is by having, you eventually get authoritarian governments that take control of this situation because the population is not happy with it. And they come in as right-wing governments, you know, on a populist wave, but actually what they're really about is cutting people's standard of living. And then what goes with that? Monopolies. Okay, so the rich, it becomes mafia capitalism. The rich gradually, companies gradually get hand in glove with governments, with these authoritarian governments. And there's no real competition between firms anymore. They're monopolies. They're monopolies authorized by the state, just like in feudal societies, right? Yeah. And what's the outcome of that? Technological innovation, increases in productivity out the window. The other effect of it is everyone's worrying about their wealth. The rich are controlling everything. They're worried about their wealth more than anything else. So no environmental, nothing, token, nothing happens. You know, give it 50, 100 years, 500 years. Okay. Pretty grim. That's why it's a ghost story. Okay, the other alternative is degrowth and revolution. That's one I'm looking forward to. The population in the rich countries goes, you know what? This is fucked. We need to do something completely different. And they go, okay, we're prepared to accept a cut in our living standards if you measure that in terms of affluent material goods. And why? What are we going to get back in what? Job security, right? You know, or not necessarily job security, but the security of material means of consumption. You know, in other words, your housing's secure, your food's secure, you're okay. You don't expect any sudden changes in your conditions as far as that goes. Control of everyday life. You know, like I'm in favor of the gift economy. So, you know, meaning that workers actually decide what they want to produce and produce it in consultation with communities. And in that sense, they have complete control over their work. You know, so you're not in a boring job, you're not alienated in your labor, you're doing things that you think are useful and so on. Greater leisure, because we can't produce as much as we are. We have to cut back in order to deal with the environmental problems we've got. We have to use much less energy. You know, my estimate is something like, you know, 10 to 15% of the energy we're now using in rich countries per capita. Right? You have to persuade people of this. And most people, when I lay this out to people, they go, that will never happen. Well, you know what? It might. The feudal option is pretty bad and gets worse. You know, decade by decade, it's getting worse and worse and worse. And the other part of this degrowth and revolution option is grassroots strategies in developing countries. So there's a way for people in developing countries to live well without destroying the environment. I mean, I've outlined this in my book on South Africa and food security, in Southern Africa, like Africa and food security, rural food security. It's not rocket science. We know how to do all this stuff. And in other words, the ordinary people of the rich countries in a situation where they're not actually exploiting the developing countries anymore, that's the first thing that leaves them with the choice of doing a similar strategy in their own countries rather than having the whole of their production oriented to supplying us with consumer goods, one thing. And the second thing is generosity, you know, well, share our technology, send people over there who want to work there. You know, like there are lots of people who enjoy that sort of work. Okay, I'll leave that with that.